Hello, Algebra Scholars. This is section 5.3, factoring trinomials in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. You'll notice this looks a lot like the last section, but there's one major difference, and that's this a. In section 5.2, we only factored trinomials whose leading coefficient was 1, and if it wasn't 1, we were able to factor out the entire leading coefficient from all three terms so that it was 1. But in this section, that's not going to happen. So it's a good bit different, and this is a video that you may need to come back to and watch a couple of times. So here's what you do. You need to find two numbers that multiply to a times c, and then add up to b. So the add up to b part is the same as it was in 5.2, but now our two numbers need to multiply to a times c, not just c. So that in our factor sum chart, this is a times c, and this is b. Once we find the two numbers, we're going to rewrite the middle term using the two numbers. We'll do some examples of that. You'll see what I mean. We'll then have 4 terms instead of 3, and then we will factor the problem by grouping. Let's go to an example. And here's our first example. So, like we do in every factoring problem, we first need to just check and make sure we like the order, and we do. And we need to check for a greatest common factor, and there isn't one. So we will go to a factor sum chart. So we need two numbers that multiply to a times c, that's -8, and then they need to add up to 7. So there's quite a few pairs of numbers that multiply to -8, but with a little bit of thinking about it, we can come up with the two numbers we need pretty quickly. -1 times 8 is -8, and -1 plus 8 is 7. So if you refer back to the previous page, it says once you find your two numbers, you're going to rewrite the middle term. So the first term, 2x squared, stays itself. But then instead of writing 7x, we're going to write minus 1x plus 8x. And then the last term stays as it was. So notice that the -1 and the 8 now show up here and here in the problem. So we now have 4 terms, and then the problem will factor by grouping. So the greatest common factor of the first 2 terms is x. If we factor that monomial out, we are left with 2x minus 1. The GCF of the last 2 terms is positive 4. And if we take that monomial out, we are left with 2x minus 1. We see that the parentheses match, so now we have a binomial GCF of 2x minus 1, and we are left with x plus 4. Alright, let's try another one on the next page. So here's an example with much bigger numbers. If we check the order first, we like it. It's x squared followed by x followed by a constant. Now in this example there is a greatest common factor. We can factor a -4 out of all 3 terms. Remember what we said back in lesson 5.1. If the first term is negative, like this one is, your GCF will also be negative. So we'll factor out a -4, and we always have to be careful when our GCF is negative. We're left with 3x squared plus 7x minus 6. And we now will do a factor sum chart for this trinomial. We see that the leading coefficient is not 1, so we need 2 numbers that multiply to -18, 3 times -6, and then add up to 7. And we see relatively quickly, I think, that those numbers are 9 and -2. So we're going to rewrite the middle term. So for the moment, we're going to ignore this GCF of -4. Maybe we'll just write ourselves a note down here to remember it for later. So we're going to rewrite the middle term as plus 9x minus 2x, and then the minus 6 we'll leave alone. And by the way, the order in which you write these two terms does not matter. Whether you write 9x minus 2x or -2x plus 9x, the factoring will look a little different, but the final answer will always be the same. So now a little FBG. We take out a 3x, and we're left with x plus 3. We take out a -2. We're also left with x plus 3. we take out a GCF of x plus 3, and we're left with 3x minus 2, but don't forget, we took a GCF out of the whole problem to get started. That needs to be part of the final answer as well.